Singapore, nicknamed the Gibraltar of the East, was the British stronghold and military base in Southeast Asia, and was the key to British imperial interwar defense planning for Southeast Asia and the Southwest Pacific. Historically, the civilian population of Singapore had been a polyglot since the late 19th century. As mining and rubber estates developed, thousands emigrated from southern China to Singapore Island, until they soon outnumbered the Malays. After the fall of Malaya, the island was reinforced by new arrival of reinforcements. General Arthur Percival's Singapore garrison numbered around 100,000 troops, mostly Indian, but including 33,000 British and 17,000 Australians. Of this figure, 15,000 men were employed in logistical, administrative, or other non-combatant roles. The remaining force was a mix of front-line and second-line troops. There were 10 brigade and 2 in reserve, divided into 49 infantry battalions. 21 of those are Indian, 13 British, 6 Australian, 4 Indian States forces assigned to airfield defence, 3 Straits Settlements Volunteer Force, and 2 Malayan. The newly arrived British 18th Infantry Division was at full strength, but lacked experience and appropriate training. Meanwhile, Yamashita 25th Army had just over 30,000 men from 3 divisions, the Imperial Guards Division, the 5th Division and full strength of the 18th Division. Also in support was a light tank brigade. However, Yamashita had less ammunition, and fewer than 24 serviceable tanks. His food supplies were running short, and he understood that the inefficient Japanese logistical chain would not be able to materially alter this situation anytime soon. Percival knew nothing of this, and assumed that the 25th Army was comprised of more than 100,000 troops, who were at least as well supplied as were the British Empire troops. In reality, his total numerical advantage was closer to 3 to 1. Meanwhile, just as Percival overestimated his enemy, Yamashita underestimated the size of the Singapore garrison too. He thought Percival had only about 40,000 troops. Across the Johor Strait, he faced one of the most thoroughly fortified positions in the world, and one that was surrounded by the moat of the Johor Strait. Across that moat, the Singapore shoreline was swampy muck, through which his landing force would be dragging themselves while exposed to concentrated enemy fire. Percival was convinced that the most likely place for a Japanese assault was on the northeast part of the strait. At the same time, he did not rule out an assault from the sea or from airborne troops, so he was faced with the requirement to defend all 70 miles of coast. He decided to fight a forward battle, in which the defenders would try to prevent a Japanese landing, and then counterattack any Japanese lodgment. Key to the defense was the employment of Percival's considerable artillery strength, which totaled 226 guns of all calibers against the Japanese while they were struggling to get ashore. Meanwhile, Yamashita assessed that the British defences were more formidable in the northeastern part of the strait, which was true since that is where Percival had placed his best unit. Instead of attacking into the teeth of the best British defences, he determined to attack in the area held by the 22nd Australian Infantry Brigade. The Japanese attack would go in with the 18th Division on the right, and the 5th Division was on the left. Also supporting the attack was the 1st Tank Regiment assigned to the 5th Division. Altogether, Yamashita massed a main attack with 16 battalions in the first wave. The attack was scheduled to begin on the night of the 8th of February. After the main attack had been delivered, a supporting attack would be conducted by the Imperial Guards Division in the area west of the causeway, which was held by the 27th Australian Infantry Brigade. This attack included a total of 7 battalions, supported by the 14th Tank Regiment. Yamashita went to great efforts to hide the location of his main thrust. The Imperial Guards Division built dummy camps in the northeast sector, conducted a demonstration attack on Urban Island, and Japanese pre-attack artillery preparations with the 168 available medium and heavy guns focused on this area. On the 5th of February 1942, Japanese troops conducted a diversion attack on the Urban Island to the northeast of Singapore, drawing British troops to move to that region. Beginning on the morning of the 8th of February, Japanese air and artillery opened up on the sector of the 22nd Australian Infantry Brigade. The Australians prepared themselves for the attack was coming, and at about 20:30 hours, landing craft were sighted approaching their positions. The main Japanese offensive against Singapore began. The first wave of Japanese troops from the 5th and 18th Divisions began crossing the Johor Strait. In total, 13,000 Japanese troops landed throughout the night, against the defenders numbered just 3,000 men. Australian troops initially inflicted heavy casualties on the Japanese landing, but confusion of battle caused them to retreat prematurely, providing Japanese a beachhead by nightfall. As the focus of the Japanese attack became clear, Percival ordered his only real reserve, the 12th Indian Infantry Brigade, to support the Australians. The first they had seen the Japanese gain their planned objectives, while the British had taken a beating, but still maintained a viable defense. During the day of the 9th of February, Japanese troops captured Tingha Airfield, while behind the front, 10,000 additional troops arrived at the beachheads. At 2100 hours after the heavy artillery fire at the sector held by the 27th Australian Infantry Brigade, the Japanese 4th Imperial Guard Regiment landed at Kranji in northern Singapore, but the attempt was driven off by Australian 27th Brigade's heavy machine gun and mortar fire. General Nishimura sought permission from Yamashita to call off his attack and land behind the 5th Division the following day. However, Yamashita denied the request. But, by 400 hours of the 10th of February, the commander of the 27th Australian Infantry Brigade, concerned that his force would be cut off by fierce and chaotic fighting at the southwest, had withdrew from the seafront, which opened the gap with the neighbouring 11th Indian Division and allowed the Japanese the opportunity to bring up the rest of the Imperial Guards Division without interference. After landing, the Imperial Guards Division was to swing east towards Seletar River and then south to interpose itself between Singapore and Changi, in order to prevent the British withdrawing into the Changi area. Bennett ordered the 22nd Australian Brigade to hold Bulim until early on the 10th of January, and then to fall back to the new secondary defensive line, Kranji-Jurong Switch Line, between the 12th and 44th Indian Brigades. But the Australian 22nd Brigade misunderstood an order and withdrew past the Jurong Road, thus exposing the flanks of neighbouring Indian troops. The Jurong line eventually collapsed, though, after the 12th Indian Brigade was withdrawn by its commander to the road junction near Bukit Panjang, after he lost contact with the 27th Brigade on his right. While the 44th Indian Brigade also misinterpreted the orders and withdrew. After sundown, Japanese 5th Division captured the Bukit Timah Heights, which overlooked Singapore and hosted 2 reservoirs of fresh water. With the vital water supply of the reservoirs in the centre of the island threatened, the Australian 27th Brigade was later ordered to recapture Bukit Panjang, as a preliminary move in retaking Bukit Timah. But, on the 11th of February, the effort was beaten back by fierce resistance from Imperial Guards troops. With Japanese supplies running low, Yamashita attempted to bluff Percival by issued his ultimatum that Percival should surrender in order to prevent further loss of life among the million civilians on Singapore Island. Percival did not respond, and the fighting continued. Still, amazing progress had been made by Yamashita's army. He had invaded an island fortress that was supposed to have held out indefinitely, and had captured at least half of it in 2 days. The next day, on the 12th of February, as the situation worsened for the Allies, they sought to consolidate their defences. During the night of the 12th of February, the order was given for a fortified perimeter to be established around Singapore City at the eastern end of the island. This was achieved by moving the defending forces from the beaches along the northern shore and from around Changi, with the British 18th Division being tasked to maintain control of the vital reservoir. On the 13th of February, with the Allies still losing ground, senior officers advised Percival to surrender in the interests of minimizing civilian casualties. Again, Percival refused. Elsewhere, the Japanese troops pushed the 55th Brigade of the British 18th Division out of its position, which controlled the last freshwater reservoir in Singapore for the British. At 1400 hours, the first battle between the Malay Regiment and Japanese soldiers occurred. The Japanese 18th Division started to attack the southwestern coast along Pasir Panjang Ridge. The Japanese were able to penetrate the defensive line, and 1st Malay Brigade forced to withdraw to Buona Vista. After being forced to withdraw from the ridge, on the 14th of February, new defense positions were hurriedly assigned to the companies in the 1st Malay Brigade. In the reputable Battle of Bukit Chandu, Company C of Malay Regiment was assigned to defend Bukit Chandu. The company was led by 2nd Lieutenant Adnan bin Seti. The company initially fought off a group of Japanese soldiers dressed as Sikhs. However, enemy attacked the company again 2 hours later, in full force. It was the 42 men in the company against 13,000 Japanese troops. What happened on the hill that day can only be described as a massacre, though the company fought their heroic, grisly ends. At about 1300 hours, the Japanese broke through and they advanced towards the Alexandra Barracks Hospital. Japanese troops of the 18th Division rushed into the hospital and bayoneted a total of 323 patients and staff members. Later, Yamashita again launched into a bluff. He instructed his artillery to keep up their fire, to suggest to the Allies that the Japanese had an unlimited amount of artillery ammunition. On the 15th of February, Percival was forced to bow to the inevitable. At a 9:30 hours staff meeting, the water situation was reported to be dire, with a total failure expected within 24 hours. Food was adequate, as was small arms ammunition, but shortages in fuel and heavier ammunition were already evident. Percival painted the situation as a choice between a counterattack to regain control of the water reservoirs, or an immediate surrender. With the counterattack clearly impossible, this left capitulation. When Wavell gave Percival discretion in a morning telegram to surrender if he felt it was no longer possible to continue fighting, Percival made plans to end resistance. At 17:15 hours, Percival and his chief of staff followed Japanese instructions to proceed to the Ford factory at Bukit Timah to meet his Japanese counterpart. Yamashita demanded an unconditional surrender from the reluctant Percival, and under threat of renewed Japanese attacks, Percival agreed after a 55-minute discussion. The surrender was signed at 18:10 hours and was effective as of 20:30 hours that evening. The 70-day campaign for Malaya and Singapore was over, and the greatest military defeat in British history is complete. Later, General Tomoyuki Yamashita gained his famous nickname, the Tiger of Malaya. British losses during the fighting for Singapore were heavy, with a total of nearly 85,000 personnel captured, in addition to losses during the earlier fighting in Malaya. About 5,000 were killed or wounded, of which Australians made up the majority. Japanese casualties during the fighting in Singapore amounted to 1,714 and 3,378 wounded. Throughout the entire 70-day campaign in Malaya and Singapore, total British casualties amounted to 8,708 killed or wounded and 130,000 captured, while Japanese losses during this period amounted to 9,824 battle casualties. During this time the Japanese had advanced a total of 1,050 kilometers from Singapore to the southern coast of Singapore at a rate of 14 kilometers one day. While impressed with Japan's quick succession of victories, Adolf Hitler reportedly had mixed views regarding Singapore's fall, seeing it as a setback for the white race, but ultimately something that currently was in Germany's military interests. Hitler reportedly forbade Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop from issuing a congratulatory communique. Later the city renamed Sionan to Japanese for Light of the South.